Welcome, thanks for being here. I'm happy to get started. We'll go ahead and I'm going to start off with a trigger warning. The following audio clip contains references to themes of lethal force, destruction, and death, which some individuals may find distressing. And I invite you all to close your eyes and listen. Welcome back to the theater here. What you heard there, between the birds and the sounds of shooting, was a swarm of Perdix drones. They're autonomous drones. And what those are, autonomous swarm drones by their very nature, they function in groups. Each drone within the swarm can communicate with its peers, allowing them to operate as a cohesive unit. And due to the complex nature of combat, Perdix are not pre-programmed individuals. They're a collective organism that share one distributed brain for decision-making and adapting to each other like swarms in nature, except for military purposes. I invite you to reflect on how those sounds made you feel, what kind of emotions they may have evoked when you were listening to them, when those sounds might have felt a bit real here together in this theater. Drone swarms and other autonomous capabilities are the reality, unfortunately, for people on the ground in Ukraine and in Gaza right this very minute. These modalities threaten to become the reality anywhere war is fought. But first, and that's what this shows here, these are scenes from Gaza as well as from Ukraine. I think it's important, though, first to trace how we got here. And to do that, I'd like to introduce you to the concept of distance in warfare. Here, what we see on the screen is a drone pilot sitting in an operating cell in the desert in Nevada, in the United States, far away from the battlefields of Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Syria, where she's watching, learning about, and potentially bombing the next marked military target. And that's what's shown on the screen. The drone she's operating is likely an MQ-9 Reaper, the same exact kind that the Netherlands has purchased 8 of, has decided to arm, and is now flying test flights since last week from Leeuwarden Air Force Base over our North Sea territory, as well as test flights over Curaçao in the Caribbean. So in an answer to how we got here, this concept of distancing is really important. And what I talk about when I talk about distancing, I want to point out that I'm talking about geographic distancing, physical distancing, but also an algorithmic distance. The physical distancing is brought to us, generally speaking, in more relatively recent times, since the advent of the war on terror, through these particular machines that you see behind me. These are the MQ-9 Reaper drones that I was just speaking about. This physical distancing has really had its coming of age, let's say, through this global war on terror. And that second level of distancing is that algorithmic distance, so moving ourselves further away from a battlefield or from decision-making on a battlefield. These kinds of modalities of war raise questions that are quite existential, I would say. What does this distancing do to the character of war? What does it mean to fight war when we're doing it so far removed from our enemy? And in the turn to algorithmic warfare, what does it even mean to be human in these contexts when we farm out these processes to machines? To dive a bit deeper into this physical distancing, this drone warfare and the global war on terror moved us from geographically centered warfare, battles fought in a particular location, to a more target-centric modality of war. So finding wherever the bad guy was and targeting him wherever he could be found. This geographic loosening of where war is fought, it necessarily then implicates more locations, and we're seeing increasingly urbanized warfare happening as well, and therefore it also implicates more uninvolved civilians in these war zones. It's also harder to know exactly where and when and exactly against whom these systems are deployed, implicating issues around transparency and accountability. Drone warfare is often packaged in this sort of political speak of a risk-free way of fighting war or a clean way of fighting war. And in so doing, the use of armed drones has lowered the threshold to use force. If it's perceived as low cost, it's easier to use them, and we've seen that empirically. The more force that's used also means the more civilians are implicated in the fighting. Now, I want to just take a bit of a step back. Distancing in warfare is not new. It did not come of age because drones came on the scenes. Ever since the bow and arrow, we were trying to remove ourselves from harm's way, which makes sense if you're thinking operationally, strategically, and tactically. The goal of distancing from a military perspective is often risk mitigation or even elimination for your own forces and maximization of the lethality against your enemy. Armed drones have transformed warfare by changing that risk calculation. It allows for greater force protection while still allowing you to accomplish your mission. So I see why it's attractive. But the idea, and again, that narrative about risk mitigation, risk elimination, I think we need to take a step back and push back on that narrative, because it doesn't eliminate risks, it shifts them, and it actually creates new ones. It shifts them to the civilians where these particular wars are being fought, and it also creates new ones for the personnel, the operators who are watching day in and day out these particular individuals whom they're marking for targeting. That risk transfer to civilians is concerning in a lot of ways, also from a legal perspective. So now turning to that second kind of distancing, algorithmic distancing, right? We're talking about how autonomous weapon systems are now allowing us to move one step further away from the battlefield by allowing decision-making processes to be partially or fully taken over by algorithmically enabled systems. And one thing I'd like to walk through really quick to show you a bit more of a concrete example is something called the OODA loop. That's very military speak. I'll walk us through what this is. The OODA loop is basically how we make decisions. It's very a cliche military term, let's say, but it's just about how we make decisions all the time. Every one of us, if you had breakfast this morning, or even if you didn't, you went through an OODA loop. You observe, you orient, you decide, and you act. You open your refrigerator and you see what you've got in there in the first place. And you orient, you think, do I want something healthy? Do I want something light? Or am I feeling like no breakfast today? You decide today is a muesli day, so I'm going to grab some yogurt and make myself a bowl. And then you act. Pull the bowl out, spoon, and make your breakfast. That's an OODA loop. In military terms, this is also how they make operational, strategic, and tactical decisions. What AI has done within this particular context is, just like AI in other spaces, it's acting as an accelerant. It speeds things up. It allows us to observe more as well. So not just faster, but also more, speed and scale. Observing more, orienting faster, giving decisions or helping decisions be made, and in some cases, acting without the involvement of humans. So I think that it's important to understand how AI applications are helping to speed this up and how it's allowing us to do more in a shorter amount of time. But there's a flip side to that speed. What you're winning strategically through that is that you're also introducing new risks, right? It's impossible very quickly for us cognitively to follow the pace at which these machines are observing, orienting, deciding, and or acting. It also introduces new risks like automation biases, the trust that we put in the computer's generated results. And I think that this, in the military context, because it can have lethal consequences, we need to do a lot more thinking about exactly how we want to be using these kinds of tools. It also implicates transparency and accountability, much like in the drone warfare space, but again at speed and scale. The black box problem of AI, not understanding exactly how, when you went from input to output, what happened in between. It's sometimes very difficult to ascertain what exactly went on. To give quite a concrete example on scale, the Israeli Defense Forces have been reported to be using AI-enabled systems, as many in the room probably know, in order to generate targeting lists. Understanding people who are on a targeting list from a military perspective, those are the people that you can, in essence, as long as you identify them, eliminate. Before AI-enabled systems were introduced on the scene, it's reported that the IDF took a year to generate 50 targets, a list of 50 names. What these systems can allegedly do is generate 100 targets in a day. So what used to take 2 years for humans to do can be done in one single day. And that volume of names, that basically feeds into a process. It creates an environment where the goal isn't identifying people positively, but rather moving through your targeting list. And that's why I think a lot of the destruction that we're seeing in Gaza is partially due to these kinds of systems. It raises legal questions about how are you able to comply with your legal obligations to identify that person and go through proportionality assessments, all of the things that the laws of war require. It raises ethical questions as well as those existential questions. So where do we go from here? Right behind me, you see the Great Hall of the United Nations. It's been in the news this week, of course, all of the big leaders having very big speeches, making lots of big promises, as they do, kicking off the UN season, as it were. Legally, some of the stuff that we need to do is to recenter the position of the civilian within warfare. Protecting civilians is part of our legal obligations. It's part of our ethical and doctrinal obligations. And by developing robust civilian harm mitigation processes, this can go a long way in curbing some of the destruction that we're seeing at scale in certain areas of conflict. Another thing we can do from a legal perspective is to learn the lessons from the global war on terror, understanding where it went wrong with civilian harm incidents, and do better, program the algorithms to avoid, to mitigate this. And that is a side of AI that is under development. There are applications that will help assist understanding the civilian environment, but we've got to make sure that that's the priority. We can interpret the existing legal frameworks, international humanitarian law, the laws of war, in light of the reason for which they were developed. Post-World War II was to avoid the scourge of war. It's in the preamble of the UN Charter, and it means that we're not looking for loopholes to fight more war, to fight faster war, to fight bigger war. We're looking to minimize the suffering due to war. We can collectively agree on a binding legal framework to cover new developments. And many of you perhaps might be skeptical in the audience about the value of treaties, but we've done it before. We banned biological and chemical weapons through these particular mechanisms with enough political will behind it, and we can do it again. There are efforts that are underway, so all is not lost. This is not like a doom scenario here, but we have to act. If there's anything that needs sped up, it's not necessarily the ODA loop, but rather the efforts to put in robust guardrails within this technological developing area. So if the question is how we move forward, the answer from me is not to ban any of these technologies or to prevent us from using things like drones in warfare, but tighter regulations that center the protection of civilians are crucial to ensuring a way of waging war that doesn't remove us from it, but rather centers our shared humanity. Thanks.